when they expose themselves to like DHT cream or something like that, they had like significant increases from the total androgen deprivation, where they basically went through like self-induced puberty. So not only did they have, you know, the gains from whatever like mechanical stuff they were doing, but the androgen exposure, they would gain like 2 to 3 inches on their penis size just by So the TRT thing, I think that's you know, cool that you're actually, you know, because a lot of people, it's sort of like there's like the science side. A lot of times they're really like myopic about looking at literature, and then the bro science side, they're very myopic about looking at anecdotal feedback and just like inject yourself with the shit and see what happens. But it's nice to see somebody like yourself who not only has like the professional credentials, but also like the social media influence, and like being like so open to doing the whole like coinciding like the bros sort of on like my side with like the real literature and like the actual like academics on this side, and like actually experimenting with yourself before you start to like put out information to get like the whole cumulative picture of it. So it should be interesting.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I felt it was important. You know, I mean, all the stuff I talk about, like ice baths, for instance, not holotropic, but tumo type breathing. I mean, years ago, 2016, I went over to Spain and spent some time with Wim Hof. It brought him to my lab. This was long before the social media stuff. You know, the work with David Spiegel's lab, but hypnosis, if I'm going to work on hormones in the laboratory and then I'm going to talk about it in terms of potential for public health, I want to have the experience of knowing what I'm talking about, literally, and the experience of it. And also, and not in any reckless way, but to try and just ground the conversation. I mean, I think that obviously a formal, rigorous training and coursework has its value. So does real life experience. I think anyone who says one or the other is the only way to go is you know, not thinking about the issue clearly. Now, people have careers and times and lives that don't allow for exploration of everything. And so ultimately what I'd like to do is serve as a bridge between communities, because I do think there are gems within the sports community and gems within the academic community and gems in all these different locations. And the idea is to kind of, you know, move all these to the center and talk about them with folks like you and others, so that we can get to a place where people are thinking about this stuff rationally. I mean, again, like what you've brought forward about breaking up dosages, for instance, or not leaping into things without first getting blood work done. These are not minor points. These are critical points for anyone who's thinking about their health and performance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, and I had to write this one down because it was something I didn't want to skim over, and I've thought of it like 5 times on this podcast, but I keep forgetting to bring it up. We were talking way at the beginning about prenatal exposure to androgens, and that was like one of the basis for your main subsections of research. And you mentioned on Rogan how estrogen exposure is what masculinizes the brain. I was wondering if you could delve into like how exactly that, like, I know, for example, like even firsthand, if I've used an aromatase inhibitor haphazardly to, you know, like back in the day when it was the dogma was you need to use an aromatase inhibitor on cycle, you must be using it to get your estrogen as low as possible, because in men, estrogen is like the antithesis of masculinity, you know, like high T, low estrogen. Like that's what you got to do for being like the most masculine person ever. But you find that you actually end up with erectile dysfunction, you know, bone mineral degeneration, like all these things when you have low estrogen. But the actual like exposure to it in adolescence, like I was under the impression that DHT exposure is what ultimately leads to like sexual differentiation and like maturation of like penis development and things of that nature. So like I was just wondering if you could explain, just for my general curiosity, like how estrogen actually does that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. So there's a literature I'm very familiar with. And you hit on a number of the key points. So there are what are called primary sexual characteristics and secondary sex characteristics. Primary sexual characteristics are typically the ones that occur prenatally in response to the androgen that's made by the fetus and or by the mom. Okay. And the reason I mentioned mom is that there are conditions of, like, for instance, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the adrenals are cranking out loads of androgens, and the babies, female or male, are seeing that, and that has an impact, et cetera. But to make it a vast literature somewhat simpler, we can say for sure that dihydrotestosterone that is produced by the male fetus produces the development of the penis, and to some extent the masculinization of the male brain. Now, when I say masculinization, I want to be really clear what I mean. This is a phrase from reproductive and developmental endocrinology. I'm not saying this for politically correct reasons. I'm saying this just to be really clear, because unlike in online communities, in biology, we have real operational definitions of what we mean. So what ends up happening is there's an area of the brain called the medial preoptic area, which differs in the clusters of neurons that exist there, and the size of those clusters vary between people who have XY chromosomes and XX chromosomes. And that's because those with XY chromosomes will produce DHT, which creates a growth of this particular pocket of cells in the brain, growth of the penis. And also on the Y chromosome, you have what's called Mullerian inhibiting hormone. So it makes sure Mullerian ducts don't form and fallopian tubes don't form. Rather, the Wolffian ducts form, the vas deferens forms, which of course brings, all sorts of important components to the penis and testes. So DHT is involved in masculinizing a good portion of the prenatal body and brain in individuals with Y chromosomes. However, the testosterone that's produced by the fetus has major effects in masculinizing certain elements of the brain of people with Y chromosomes. And here again, I'm not saying people with Y chromosomes to avoid saying male. I'm saying this because in a moment, I'll tell you where this can actually get confusing for certain individuals that are XY, but are born appearing female, which does happen. So DHT is responsible for some of the primary sexual characteristics, for sure. But testosterone that aromatizes into estrogen also has major effects in establishing these so-called sexually dimorphic pathways of the brain, meaning pathways in the brain that are present in one sex, males, and not in the others, or vice versa. Now, there is some critique of this recently, that this is true in mice, but not in humans, because in humans that don't have the gene for aromatase, but are XY, it doesn't seem as if there are any impairments in masculinization of the brain. However, there is this situation in genetics. You often hear of somebody who has a gene or doesn't have a gene, but there's this condition that we call a hypomorph. A hypomorph is somebody that has the gene, but they make very little of the particular gene product. And so you see
that's an individual that has like a mutation in the gene that encodes for aromatase, and then they just end up with total estrogen deprivation the entirety of their lives if they don't supplement with exogenous estrogen. Is that
there are people that have very, very, very little estrogen. I mean, there are other sources of estrogen in the male body besides testosterone aromatized into estrogen. But they are body fat, for instance, can churn out some estrogen, but not a ton.
So do those individuals end up with like cardiovascular disease and neurodegeneration if they don't use exogenous E2?
They can have issues. I don't know whether or not that's it. You would predict that. I'll just say that your prediction is spot on with the biochemistry, but whether or not that hasn't really been explored.
Sorry, I just get interested on side tangents as you're going.
No, but it's an important point that you're making, because the point that you're making is directly in line with this larger theme that estrogen is critical for cardiovascular health, and that's something that's relevant to everybody. Male or female, and regardless of hormone levels. So it's fascinating. And you ask, well, why would aromatized estrogen be responsible for masculinizing certain circuits within the brain? Why would that be? Well, it has to do with these long, slow effects of steroid hormones. As you know, there are fast effects and there are slow effects. And some of them, when I say fast, I don't mean within seconds or minutes, but they're within a day or two of a spike in testosterone. There are noticeable effects on psychology, et cetera. But then there are the gene expression effects. So as you know, but just for your audience, steroid hormones, because they're essentially lipid soluble, they can pass through the double layered membrane of a cell, but they can also go into what's called the nuclear envelope, which is where the DNA of the cell is housed. So this is amazing, right? Most compounds will bind to a receptor on a cell surface, like dopamine will bind to a cell surface, and then or cell surface receptor, and then it has these so-called G protein coupled pathways, and it's sort of like all the dominoes fall, and then it has an effect. Other things will bind and have a much faster effect. Steroid hormones can actually pass into cells and go into the nucleus and change which genes those cells will express by controlling what are called transcription factors. And transcription factors are essentially like a menu of genes that will then, and proteins that will be expressed. So the way that testosterone, which is converted into estrogen through aromatase, masculinizes the male brain, air quotes, because it doesn't like make the fetus like talk with a deeper voice or something yet. Yeah. What it does is it sets up the circuit so that later, that when that child is born and is prepubertal, all of that is lying quiescent, as we say, waiting. All those circuits in the brain, some of them are active, right? There are differences. There are reported sex differences between boys and girls. There are reported hormone differences between boys and girls. But then when puberty happens, and the hypothalamus releases the pituitary to allow the pituitary to signal the gonads, well, then testosterone hits the system, and then those circuits in the brain are allowed to be activated by testosterone directly. Yeah. So it's an interesting twist, and it's often surprising. And I think whereas in females, right, the estrogen is acting, there's a different pathway that ensures that masculinization of these circuits does not occur. And that's through a completely different and somewhat more convoluted biochemical pathway. But it's really amazing, because what it means is that the brain is sort of getting set up by hormones and set to be ready and then activated. And the case that really illustrates this the most dramatically is in XY individuals who have a mutation in 5-alpha reductase. This was actually the way that 5-alpha reductase was discovered.
The pseudohermaphrodites, right?
Yeah. So these are individuals that lack 5-alpha reductase, of course, the enzyme that converts testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, excuse me. And as we mentioned before, dihydrotestosterone is responsible for growth of the penis and some of the masculinizing effects on the fetal brain. So what happens is these individuals who have this mutation, which is quite common in certain areas, I believe of the Dominican Republic. There's some individuals, there's another pocket of individuals elsewhere. It's a familial genetic thing. These babies come into the world and they either have what looks to be like an enlarged clitoris or a standard female genitalia. And then what happens is, around the time of puberty, the testes start releasing testosterone, and there are some direct effects of testosterone on the growth of that tissue, which is actually what the name is kind of it's not, doesn't sound great. It's a vestigial penis, as they call it. It's just basically, it's not a clitoris. Yes, that's more common, the street name. Yeah. And then it grows, and so they literally sprout what appears to be a penis. And the outcomes for these individuals in terms of what they select is quite interesting. Culturally this is known. And so some of them choose to go on to live as men. Others choose to have a gender reassignment surgery. Others don't. It's kind of varied, and it probably depends a lot on the social conditions, but also on what they're thinking about, their neural structures too. So it's fascinating. And I think brings us back to something we talked about way back at the beginning, which is that, how you or me or any individual reacts to a hormone therapy or a deficit of a hormone of any kind, in many ways will be reflective of a lot of developmental events that took place long before we were born. And it's not just, this is a case where we can truly just say it's not just people with XX or XY. And actually there are people who have double X chromosome, double XY. There are people that have XYY. We've discovered now that there are many different chromosomal arrangements of this kind. But what that means is that how one person reacts to something and another in terms of hormone treatment differs, because some people have certain machineries there and other people have less or more of it. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, I've actually seen in like twins where one has the gene mutation that encodes for 5AR deficiency or a lack of 5-hour development, I should say. They end up like with no temporal recession of their hairline, and in some cases more muscular than their twin brother counterparts that don't have a deficiency. And it's like as a consequence of the lack of 5-alpha reduction, they have more testosterone remaining as test to agonize the AR and cause, muscle protein synthesis, presumably, because DHT is essentially like inactivated, I guess, in skeletal muscle, where it's not as potent of a like protein accretion tool for actually building contractile tissue than testosterone is. So they end up more hair and more jacked than their brother, but they have a micro penis. Like, it's kind of weird that, like, what I've seen, but
Interesting. So, I when I was a postdoc, which is again like this residency, my postdoc advisor was a very interesting guy. Unfortunately, he passed away for other reasons related to what I'll tell you in a moment. But he was born female, identical twin, which is really interesting. Identical twin sister. Their mother had been treated with a anti-miscarriage drug during pregnancy. Presumably they had seen different levels of this drug. So he was born female. From a very early age, prior to puberty, he reported not feeling as if he was in the right body. And he eventually had gender reassignment surgery. He was a close friend and a colleague, and he was obviously taking TRT. So female to male transition. He was one of the people that because I knew him quite well, a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant. But he was the one who, because he was taking andro cream. And he was one of the people who initially told me, he said, the testosterone therapy had a number of powerful psychological effects for him, in one of the, not the least of which was that it made him want to work more and more and more. And this was this kind of effort feels good thing. And he reported very fast effects of that, probably because his system hadn't seen much androgen. So he would experience, like, within minutes of putting on the andro cream, maybe it was placebo effect, right? But he would feel, he would report a kind of a lift in energy and drive and focus. So it's interesting. And I think that if we were to look with neuroimaging, we would probably find that there's a range of brain phenotypes depending on how much androgen people had seen in utero. Yeah.
I've actually seen certain cases of like certain individuals. There's like a community called it's called like PE, like penis enhancement, and these individuals will use things like water filled pumps and like stretching devices and stuff to try and stretch out the the ligament that attaches their penis to their body, essentially, and create like vascular kind of like engorgement to increase their width as well as their length. But individuals who were like androgen deprived in their youth and otherwise had micro penises, when they expose themselves to like DHT cream or something like that, they had like significant increases from the total androgen deprivation, where they basically went through like self-induced puberty. So not only did they have, the gains from whatever like mechanical stuff they were doing, but the androgen exposure, they would gain like 2 to 3 inches on their penis size just by kind of like putting themselves into the environment that they otherwise missed out on during adolescence, which I thought that was interesting, how it could kind of like happen later after oftentimes I think people think the closure of like the epiphyseal plate automatically equates to nothing can happen from a growth aspect at this point. But maybe that's more like structurally from a skeletal aspect. But I mean, even from like a penis growth aspect, it's kind of shocking to see individuals in their like adulthood, like growing, like missing their kind of like teenagehood, being able to like make up for it with androgen exposure. So I don't know, interesting point.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, having spent a long portion of my career working on so-called critical periods where the brain is very plastic, and then this idea is that those critical periods shut. We now know that the brain is plastic throughout the entire lifespan, but the conditions for that plasticity just change. And I think that what you're describing is a sort of a hormone-induced tissue plasticity. There's also the experiment that we've seen many times, and I think you've done some posts on this, where somebody's head looks completely different. This head looks completely different from 2 years earlier. Maybe they're doing the jaw exercise, maybe they're training their neck, maybe they're doing all sorts of things and had plastic surgery, but oftentimes it's because they're taking growth hormone and they look like a different human being. And so we are growing all the time. I mean, also our ears grow our entire lifespan. Our nose grows our entire lifespan. This is why in very old people, they have big ears. And it's a real thing.
Yeah. Have you heard of the experiment that teenagers are doing? Well, not a lot of them, but some of them are doing now, where they're using, this is like a makeshift, like get taller / bigger dick protocol, essentially. And they're using aromatase inhibitors to prevent epiphyseal plate closure, which then allows them to get taller potentially. They're using growth hormone concurrently with the aromatase inhibition component to enhance like stature overall. And then they're also using DHT exposure to grow their penises like as much as they can during. So they have like this, basically they've like eliminated the rate limiting step by which they stop puberty of like their, skeletal infrastructure. And they're trying to like concurrently grow their organ down here and get as tall as possible simultaneously. And it's sort of like a byproduct of some of the literature on like, dwarfs and stuff like that. But it's crazy, some of the biohacking stuff people are doing nowadays.
Yeah, I had not heard that. I mean, so when I hear stuff like that, I have to take a dual response on. I mean, that part of me just thinks, whoa, I don't think anyone should be, cowboying their endocrinology without a physician. And then the other part of me, which is more of it's also part of me, but I sort of raise this flag of compassion too, where I have to assume that while there might be a subset of individuals who are doing this just to kind of see what happens, I have to imagine that a number of people are doing this because they're feeling a real need to do this from some sense of lack or, and so here's what I think would be great is in the next 5 or 10 years that hormone clinics can start to evolve to the place where it isn't like you can get whatever you want or do whatever you want, but that there's a thoughtful discussion about how to do things safely, right? Yeah. That's really what it's about, right? It's really about how can people achieve their health and lifestyle goals in a way that's really safe, because we can look to the extremes, bodybuilders who died extremely young from diuretics or androgen abuse. You can look at, the most deadly mental health condition of all. As surprised to learn this, but it's absolutely true. The most deadly mental health condition is anorexia bulimia, anorexia nervosa, bulimia in a short second place. 1 in 5 people with anorexia die or commit suicide. And so it's like, this is like, those numbers are incredible and in the terrible sense of the word. And so I think that if people are exploring hormone augmentation for various purposes, I think that they need to do it safely, because these things have these slow, fast, and long-term effects. And so I have to imagine if people are doing this, it's because they feel a kind of desperate need to change something, obviously. And I just think that physicians who really can work with them is the solution, right? Yeah.
What do you think about, there's a lot of teenagers getting into anabolics at a younger age now based on, influence of social media. They want to look like their, idol who's in their late 20s and has developed their physique over a span of multiple years of androgen, abuse or whatever. Some of these individuals are not just using like testosterone, which at least, it's bioidentical. You would sort of know what to predict from what happens to test exposure. Not that I would condone it, but using things like heavily psychoactive drugs like trenbolone, which like you can see what happens in like, rodents when they expose themselves to these compounds, and you can sort of extrapolate for humans. But do you think, like from a neuroplasticity aspect, do you think there is risk of permanent psychological changes from exposure to these compounds